Hi, Dick.
So,
Happy to see you again.
good to see you too again, Ole.
Welcome to my magnificent apartment.
Yeah.
I came here from a 2-bedroom apartment to the 1-bedroom.
Yeah, we did some videos in Ole's museum, as he called it, which was 2 conjoined apartments. And this is the first formal one. We've done some informal things in this apartment. But anyway, today, every time I talk to you, Ole, I find out something else that you did that I didn't know about that I'm interested in. And once a few months ago, we talked about your time at the Pentagon, which was something new to me, and in specific about some things to do with Robert Mcnamara, with some meetings to do with representatives of various companies concerning supersonic aircraft and so forth. So if you just want to take it from there and tell me what you want to tell me.
Well, one day my son asked me, what do you do working at the Pentagon? I said, well, I played second fiddle in Mcnamara's band. So, no matter what your rank was, why, you were just a fiddle player in Mcnamara's band. But the reason I went in there, first of all, before that, I was on the air staff. I was the director of quality and reliability. And I got a call one day from personnel. They were considering moving me into the Secretary of Defense's office. So the reason for that move was that in one of the hearings of the House Appropriations Committee, General Mark Bradley was testifying, and the issue was, why do you let contracts, follow-on contracts, with the same contractor that you had originally? Why don't you compete all this stuff? His simple answer was, we did not have the technical data to complete it. You need some decent technical data to give it to some prospective bidders.
Right.
And they said, well, why don't you have the data? And he didn't really have a direct answer to that, but anyway, before long, Mr. Mcnamara was testifying, and they hit him with the same question.
And he was testifying before Congress?
Right, before the House Appropriations Committee.
Okay.
So he repeated the same story that General Bradley had given him, but they said, well, what are you doing about it? He said, well, what I've done, I've established a new office called the Director of Technical Data and Standardization Policy. And his responsibility will be to make sure that we have the technical data we need. And the general who was in charge of that was an Army Major General, Stanwix Hay. He said, that's a long name to deal with, well, you just call me General Stan. But it wasn't long before General Stan moved up the line to an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I became the director.
Okay, what time period are we talking about, Ole?
Let's see, I'll have to stop and think here a little bit. That would have been probably the early 1960s, 62, 63, somewhere around there.
Okay.
We can verify that thing later on.
Well, what was your tenure at the Pentagon?
I was in the Pentagon, in the Air Force staff. I was there for about a year, and then I was there for 2.5, 3 years, probably 3 or 3.5 years in the Secretary of Defense's office.
Okay, but do you remember when you started?
Well, let's see, the initial, I could look these dates up. That's so many years ago now, I've kind of forgotten the dates. But I retired in 1970, and so I'd say it was the early 60s that I was up there in the Air Staff and the Secretary of Defense's office.
Okay, well, I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought there, but I wanted to establish the general time reference.
Sure. So anyway, General Stan was the Director of Technical Data and Standardization Policy, and I was the Deputy Director. And I must say that that was the finest relationship between a boss and a sub-boss that I've ever seen. He said, I want to be sure that you and I both understand what our jobs are. He said, I'm Mr. Outside, that I'll deal with Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and major issues with the press. You run the office. He said, you may select the people we put in it, they will be reporting to you. And he said, I think we'll get along fine. And we did. We had a very excellent relationship. I wrote many of his speeches, and speeches for people like Secretary Mcnamara to give. And so I can say that I was, in that job, I succeeded an Army Major General. When time came for me to rotate back to the Air Force, I was succeeded by a Vice Admiral for the Navy. So there I was. I didn't get a promotion, but I succeeded a Major General, and I was replaced by an Army or Navy Admiral.
And what was your rank?
I was a colonel.
Full colonel?
Yeah. Now, when the office was established, one of the things that we had to do was take over the Defense Standardization Program, which was handled by the Defense Supply Agency. So the decision was made that we would move that group into the Secretary of Defense's office. So General Stan gave me the job of selecting the people from that group who would form the core of the civilians in our staff. And I interviewed them, and out of that group of some 60 people, I think I probably picked 25 or 30 whom I thought would be the most capable to take over a renewed standardization program. Now, I was all in favor of standardization when it made sense. For example, one of the first things that we did was achieve the standardization of firefighting, fire engine fittings. Because at that time, with NATO as it was, an American airplane could land at a British or French or German base, and the fires and our hoses on the fire trucks didn't match up with the equipment on the ground. So we got everybody throughout NATO standardized so that each of us could land at the other guy's bases and refuel our planes. So I thought that was a good example of standardization.
So how did you go about doing that?
Well, we worked with NATO staff. I had some very good friends from my previous tour in France, and was connected up with NATO. So we were able to sit down with some of the technical people in the NATO staff and got in the operations people in. In fact, one of the guys we worked with was Chuck Yeager. He was a commander of a fighter squadron at that time, and he had some good connections for us. So anyway, it didn't take long for everybody to realize that was a pretty good thing to standardize. Now, another standardization program, one that I disliked intensely, was the Mcnamara Project number 13. Number 13 was the standardization of our belt buckles. Now, at that time, the Army and the Navy both had a plain brass belt buckle. The Air Force had the same buckle, but it was silver. The Marines, to go you one better, had a beautiful, big, heavy black belt buckle with the Marine emblem on it. They were all different. So somebody had suggested to Mr. McNamara, maybe he thought we should standardize these buckles. So I picked that program up well into the game, and I determined that we'd already spent $8 million trying to find a durable, standard black paint for the Marine buckles. It was, I don't know, something like $7 or $8 million. So I wrote a little memo to Secretary McNamara that, sir, I've reviewed this program, and I find that we spent $7 million trying to generate the kind of paint that we need to make a standard Marine belt buckle. I recommend we just terminate this program. Came back, okay. So when I put that in, somebody said, boy, you're putting your neck on the line to compete with Mr. McNamara like that. Well, it was an obvious standardization program, so we now all have our own independent belt buckles. So,
well, what did the Marines use for the black on the belt buckle?
I don't remember. I do not remember. It had to be standard. It had to be durable. Flat colored black. But I forget what they had on it. But anyway, that's a little battle we won.
So was the Marine belt buckle a different physical buckle or was it just a different color?
It was pretty similar, but it's just a totally different color, and it had boldly on it the Marine emblem. So, but the Army and the Navy got along without putting their titles on their belt buckles.
Supersonic data.
Yes. Supersonic data. That was the days when we were.
I tell you, Ole, hang on a second. Let me. I want to put a different mic on here that I think might pick you up a little better. Let me. I forgot to put it on, but let me put it on now. This might isolate any extraneous noise, and then we'll start again on that. Supersonic data.
Okay, at this time, the French and the British had gotten together, and they developed a supersonic transport. That was a beautiful airplane, carried about 100 people, but you could make a very quick trip from Washington, D.C. to London or Paris on that, which I forgot what the time was, but it was a little over an hour. I know my boss at one time had to get to Paris in a hurry, and he flew on the SST, and said it was interesting, but it was just too fast. But anyway, we had quite a bit of competition in the United States, and it finally boiled down to the point where it looked like Lockheed, maybe General Dynamics, and possibly North American were the leading contractors to build a supersonic transport. And we were called together when they showed us a movie that showed Secretary Mcnamara standing up on Capitol Hill with, let's see, who else was with him? I think maybe it was the Secretary of the Air Force and whoever was the head of NASA at that time. And Mr. Mcnamara indicated that clearly the development of the supersonic transport by the United States was a major factor in the future of our country. And he understood that one of the things that the manufacturers needed, though, was the information on the supersonic aircraft that we had in the inventory. Of course, most of these were Air Force or Navy planes. And so he asked the secretaries if they would assure that the Defense Department and the contractors working on our programs, of course the supersonic transports or supersonic planes at that time were built primarily by General Dynamics and North American, and the engine companies were involved there, the Pratt & Whitney and General Electric. So he asked if Defense Department would provide full support to the contractors involved in the supersonic transport program. And the answer is, well, certainly, Mr. Vice President. I think the Vice President was involved at that time too. So anyway, we were shown this movie in a meeting that was called, well, let me back up just a little bit. They wanted to have a meeting in the Secretary of Defense's office with the major contractors who would be involved in the supersonic program in America. Now here we're talking the engines. We're talking Pratt & Whitney and General Electric. In the aircraft, of course, we're talking about Lockheed and North American and Boeing and all the major contractors. And the job was to get these people in a meeting with the Secretary of Defense. At that time, Mr. Mcnamara was tied up on something else, so Cyrus Vance was the Deputy Secretary. Was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So I was given the job of putting together a memorandum from Cyrus Vance to the contractors, inviting them to a highly classified meeting in his office on a certain date, and the request of these contractors was that they, the head men, and their chief technical people attend the meeting. Said the meeting will be concerning supersonic aircraft data. Very cold, very cold letter. Didn't say very much.
And who wrote that letter? You did?
I wrote the wire. I wrote the telegram.
Okay.
And it went out with Secretary of Vance's signature on it. So who showed up? But the guys, like, I'll just mention a few names. Dan Houghton, who was president of Lockheed at that time, supported by Kelly Johnson. Of course, everybody knew Kelly Johnson. He was probably the outstanding supersonic man in the country at that time. The president of General Dynamics was there. The president of North American was there. And I said both engine companies were there, Pratt & Whitney and GE. And so at the start of the meeting, they showed this movie of the Secretary of Defense talking to General Bozo McKee, who was the head of the Federal Aviation Agency. McKee was the 4-star general in the Air Force, who at one time had been the commander of the Air Logistics Command. Where he got the name Bozo, I'm not sure. Probably got it at West Point. But yeah, it was General McKee who was there, and he sort of chaired the meeting along with General Stan. Now, Secretary Vance was ill at the time, so General Stan McSay, my boss, and General Bozo McKee sort of coordinatingly shared the meeting. And we made it clear at that time that the purpose of the meeting was to arrange for the defense contractors who already had experience with supersonic planes to make available everything they knew about supersonic flight to the proposed contractors in the American SST program. Well, you can imagine people like Kelly Johnson sort of straightened up and, me? What am I going to give? I can't give them anything. CIA has to get involved. CIA was represented there, by the way. And of course, the head of General Dynamics sort of straightened up, and he didn't look very happy. In fact, nobody looked very happy. But anyway, General McKee made it quite clear that as far as the President of the United States was concerned, this was a high priority project. And he had been promised that the Secretary of Defense would work with the services to be sure that the competing contractors for the American SST program would be able to take advantage of everything that the military knew about supersonic engines and flight. And of course, GE and Pratt & Whitney were a little bit upset about divulging their data, particularly since those are the two contractors that would be involved in the engines. And anyway, the meeting went on, not a friendly meeting, but not unfriendly either. But they finally got down to the point that, of course, CIA had to be involved too.
Okay, explain. We've discussed this at a previous occasion, but explain for the camera why the CIA had to be involved.
Well, that's because we had the supersonic reconnaissance airplanes. You remember after who was the guy that was shot down?
Francis Gary Powers in the U-2.
After Powers was lost, they went to work with Kelly Johnson in the Skunk Works, developing a supersonic high-altitude airplane that would replace the U-2 that we were using at that time, and that Kelly Johnson was, or that Powers was shot down in. So we now had these airplanes pretty much belong to CIA. They control the airplanes. I think the pilots worked for them, and even the pilots who were lost were CIA. They were probably Air Force pilots, but they belonged to CIA. So it became obvious that CIA was going to have to be involved in the transfer of any information on our supersonic planes to these other contractors who were already competitors, but would now be competitors for the aircraft and the engines for the supersonic transport. So I said, well, okay, we need to have a focal point in the Air Force, or for the Department of Defense, and for CIA. And General Stan said, well, Ole Griffith will be the Defense Department representative. Bozo, who are going to have for CIA. So they said, well, Mr. So-and-so from the Federal Aviation Agency, or, the thing had survived in the Air Force, in the government administration.
Yeah, you said he asks Bozo who would be representing the CIA or the FAA.
FAA.
Okay, all right. Just want to clarify that.
That's right.
Okay.
So his name was put down. So he and I were the two guys that were named to settle any arguments that might come up. Well, happily, no real arguments came up. There were many questions that came up, but he and I, working together with the contractors and the proposed new contractors, were able to iron those things out. So we didn't have any real big issues. Fortunately, that whole potential problem was canceled when the Congress killed the SAE, repealed the supersonic program. They just voted that, hey, we don't need a supersonic transport. I think that was the new president of the United States that largely pushed that. I guess that was what, Jimmy Carter? I think it was Jimmy Carter. Well, anyway, those high-level guys. So that took me off that program. I had nothing to do with it, but I did learn a lot about supersonic flight and some of the politics involved. But really nothing came of it. But it was an interesting assignment.
So what can you tell me about the personalities involved?
Well,
Kelly Johnson, for instance, what was your impression of him, and how did you get along with him, as well as
the oaths of office I took, and my feeling of responsibility. Now that I was wearing a purple suit, if you're an officer in the Secretary of Defense's office, why you're not supposed to be concerned with your own program, with your own service. But Kelly Johnson, of course, was an extremely brilliant man, and extremely jealous of all that he had done. But they cooperated.
You say extremely jealous, you mean he was protective? Protective of what he had done?
Protective of what he'd done, that's right. So of course he and his people in the Skunk Works were bound to be involved in a supersonic transport. So that was an interesting situation. The president of General Dynamics at first was very much opposed to giving up technical data. Of course, we have the Aardvark airplane now that was supersonic, and early in the game he appeared to be very much against this idea of exchanging data. But then finally, toward the end of the program, he said, well, that as far as we're concerned, if this is the #1 program with the president, let's go with it. So I think it was the guy who was president of General Dynamics at that time had sort of swung the balance in favor of supporting the Senator and the Secretary of Defense.
What about the people from North American? Because obviously they were involved in, for instance, the development of the XB-70.
They didn't have too much to say in that meeting, but they were fully cooperative as we went along. Of course, that was about the time we lost the first B-70, and that was a big black mark on the program.
Okay, well, that can be an edit point here. What other topics?
Well, there was another subject that came up. We had.
Hang on a second, and let me just tweaking the positioning of the camera here just a little bit. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, another program that came up was the program to convert the American system of measurement to the metric system. And of course, this was a subject of huge discussion throughout American industry. There were a lot of people who were in favor of it, a lot of people who were unfavorably impressed with it. And I wound up as a sort of a Department of Defense representative of many of the industry associations. And we had many meetings. I was trying to collect all of the defense information and attitudes that I could.
And what was your position at the Pentagon at this time?
I was still the Deputy Director of Technical Data and Standardization Policy, although I may have become the Director by this time. When General Stam moved up to an Assistant Secretary of Defense job, I wound up as the Director of the office. So I presented the viewpoint of those who favored going metric. I was personally in favor of it myself, but in the final analysis, a decision was made, I guess, by Congress, listening to many people, many not too knowledgeable people, who really opposed the idea. So, you know, the tremendous cost of converting everybody and getting all the people who are driving highways to recognize the difference between 60 kilometers an hour and 60 miles an hour. And it's just too much for the country to absorb. So I never really got into the details of the arguments in Congress, but they finally killed the idea of going metric.
So was this something that Congress was considering doing, and they were looking to the Pentagon for their input?
Well, I think they were just looking for input from everybody. And of course, we had a lot of the American industry, the aircraft industry had a lot to say about it, but also the automotive industry and the teaching industry, and I guess everybody who could be affected by the conversion to metric was involved. A lot of opposition to it, a lot of philosophical and metrics, just attitudes of the school system. Mm-hmm. So it was just too big a bite for them to swallow. But it was an interesting program. Actually, I was quite hopeful that we would go metric.
What was your personal reason?
Well, I'm an engineer, and I have a couple of master's degrees in engineering, and I'd done enough calculations of converting inches to centimeters and microcentimeters and multi-centimeters, multiplying everything by 10. I thought it was a very simple way to go, but it just didn't work out that way.
Okay. We can do I'll do another edit break there. And what other subjects do you want to talk about?
I mean, when I was in the Secretary of Defense's office? Or?
To do with Secretary of Defense or any other subject. I mean, you've never really talked about your experience flying the F-101s, for instance.
Well, of course, Mcnamara was big on standardization and unification, or bringing things together, simplifying costs. One of the big programs that he was interested in was value engineering, and Secretary Vance was a big pusher of that. Value engineering was a subject where the symbol of value engineering was a paperclip. The idea being that to hold your tie in place, you had to have a clip. Generally, if you were an executive, well, you had a very nice paper clip with maybe diamonds and so on, and the logo of your company. I remember the people who were interested in the metric system had a little abacus. Remember the Oriental abacus?
Right.
Was the IBM symbol. I went to their advanced technology course one time, and I wore a pin with the abacus on it. But the Defense Department decided that, okay, showing a paperclip would get the point across. You could do the same job with an inexpensive paperclip. So actually, I turned out, I was sort of the guy pushing this from the Department of Defense side, value engineering, because I thought it was a pretty good idea. You know, in the design phase, you're going to perform some function. What is the least expensive but still effective way of performing that function? You know, many things could be, say, okay, there's a similar device on the airplane already in use. It works well. Why don't you use that same device instead of adding a new one? Or, well, in the case of the B-1 secondary power system, when I got you into a later date, there was a device that was built by Garrett, designed and built by Garrett, to provide secondary power source on the B-1 bomber. And the purpose of that was to provide a way of driving the driven instruments such as generators and voltage meters and a lot of devices that were normally driven by the engine, the propulsion engine, would be driven by this secondary power system.
So essentially an APU that would be in use
That's
continuously.
what we came up with. Garrett won the prize, and we had basically an APU, two of them, one on each pair of engines, and they drove these gearboxes, and then the generators and alternators and vacuum pumps and everything else were attached to that gearbox. And that gets me to another interesting story later on. But that was the kind of thing that McNamara pushed, and the Air Force was pushing it. Now, in the course of my time in the Air Force office, now this was I was in the Secretary of Defense's office, but I was still noted as an advocate of value engineering. I got an invitation from the British Air Ministry to go over and speak to British industry about value engineering and how we use it in the Air Force, in the government over here. And my host over there was a gentleman from Rolls-Royce. And I was very well treated by the Royal Air Force and the executive people in the government agencies. Was given some nice tours over there, and some notes of thanks and so on. So I don't think they ever converted to value engineering. But I remember at one time, somebody from Rolls-Royce said, well, what could you do with a Rolls-Royce to make it more accessible to the American public using value engineering? I said, well, now I love the Rolls-Royce. I couldn't afford one, but you have the most beautiful woodwork in the fuselage, in the structure of that car. Beautiful imported wood from all over the world. You know, there are plastic things that would look just as nice. You could polish them up. The instruments that you have on there, they're beautiful instruments, but it seems to me that they could be developed into a much more cost-effective form. And you could probably cut the price of a Rolls-Royce by a third by doing things like this, which would make it much more agreeable with people in the United States. Oh, well, thank you very much. That was the end of that.
So was this the value engineering program? Was it just a design philosophy, or was there procedures implemented to review and evaluate designs from the value engineering
That's
perspective?
a very good point. Yes, we pushed that through our contracting officers, and many of our contracts had value engineering little clauses in them, so that it gave a financial advantage to the contractor, who could say, he could show us that he had indeed, using the principles of value engineering, incorporated such a change into his design, and it would save so many $1 million. So it actually, I think, did have a beneficial effect to both to industry and to the government.
So there were manuals and procedures in place then to
The contractor was expected to develop procedures for that. We didn't have much procedure in the Air Force, but it was the idea of making an incentive to the contractor to use those principles.
Okay, so there were some things written into contracts that that provided for this, and you as the Air Force, for instance, looked favorably upon those things.
Right.
So.
I must admit that there was one time that I was invited to speak at a Department of Defense industry meeting on the West Coast with all the major contractors, and the Air Force general who was in charge of the meeting was noticeably opposed to value engineering. So an assistant secretary of defense said, I want you to straighten General so-and-so out on this subject. And I said, well, sir, no, it isn't. It's not customary for colonels to straighten out 3-star generals. I said, I'll do the best I can of explaining it, but from then on it's up to the general.
Okay, we can do an edit point here. Seems to me there was something something that popped into my head that I wanted to follow up on. Let me think, before we move on to any other subject. I should be taking notes, I guess, to see what I want to follow up with you about. Well, is there something you want to talk about? Anything else you want to talk about your time at the Pentagon?
Well, do you want to go into my career in aviation?
Well, hang on. I know what I was going to ask you about. Were you at the Pentagon when the TFX program was being implemented?
Right. I was there. My boss was the lead man in the Air Force in trying to support the Secretary of Defense's decision on the TFX program, which went to North America. And he was a major general, very highly regarded, very excellent man in the acquisition business. And he was almost full-time preparing a justification for the decision to give that program to General Dynamics, because there was a lot of competition for it. TFX, I think, stood for Tactical Fighter X, to be determined. It turned out to be an Army and a Navy airplane, and it was called the Aardvark. I don't know where they picked the Aardvark.
Air Force and Navy.
Pardon?
Air Force and Navy.
Air Force and Navy, yeah.
Right.
Thank you for that correction.
And ultimately just Air Force.
Right.
Of course, the Royal Australian Air Force also flew it, and I believe the British also.
Incidentally, speaking of the Aardvark, you know, the defense, the thing we call the boneyard down at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, it's officially it's the Department of Defense Storage and Disposition Facility, but it's a self-supporting organization. They take these airplanes, military and civilian, that have been ruled as out of service, but still saved for future use, and they've been taking off the parts and selling them, and that was provided the self-support for that organization. And the biggest supporter was Australia, because they also purchased the Aardvark, and we had a whole bunch of useless Aardvarks sitting down there, but we were supporting Australia for many years. Now, Australia finally had other airplanes that superseded the Aardvark, so there we are down there at Davis-Monthan with all these Aardvarks and no customer to buy them. So I don't know what arrangements they made there, but they came up with something else.
Well, my understanding was the F-111 really came into...
Pardon?
My understanding is that the F-111 really came into its stride, if you will, as an electronics warfare aircraft.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That was probably after your involvement you had in the program. Right. Do you know what the Australians nicknamed the F-111?
No.
The Flying Opera House.
The Flying Opera House. I didn't know that.
When I flew in the reserves at Luke, Special Operations H-3s, we had an Australian exchange pilot, Nick Hobson, and he explained that they called it the Flying Opera House because because both came in over budget and behind schedule. But I understand that the Australians were pleased with the aircraft, though.
But good.
Good, yes. Talk about what you want to talk about, Ole.
Well, I think you might be interested in just hearing about the way I got interested in aviation. I was 5 years old. Dad was a preacher in Owensboro, Kentucky. And I was arrested one day for riding my tricycle down the main street of town. And the police officer said, "What are you doing, Sonny?" I said, "I'm coming down to look at the airplane." "There's no airplane down here." I said, yes, sir, there is. He said, would you show it to me? So he puts me in the sidecar, and I said, it's the Ford agency down here. So we go down to the Ford agency, and here's this beautiful red airplane sitting in the window. And he said, well, I'll be darned. So then he took me home and said, Reverend, said, you got to keep your son off the highway. So anyway, Dad discovered that I was really interested in airplanes. So he took me down to this shuttle, to the shop, and we met the pilot. And there's quite a story behind it. This guy was a naval pilot in World War I, and when he came back to the States, he bought a little airport near Owensboro, Kentucky. It's a little town in the central part of Kentucky. And he was going to build and sell German airplanes, or private airplanes. And he came up with a design that was pretty characteristically a German design. It looked like a Fokker D7. And so he told Dad that he had already sold 6 of these, and the plane on display was the number 7 airplane, and that he would be flying that on Monday morning, and he knew where Dad's home was, the residence of the church, the manse of the church. And he told Dad, he said, I will fly over your house and wave to you, and your son can see the plane. So Dad and I are sitting out on the porch. Mother and my sister were asleep upstairs, and this plane came up right over, because it was a mile away from our house. Came up over the trees, and he goosed his engine a little bit and waved to us, and we waved to him. Something fell off, and I said, oh, Dad, it's a candy drop. You know, a big advertising thing then was airplanes to drop candy bars with little paper parachutes, and the kids would run over town and see the ads for Baby Ruth candy and whatever. So that was the lower wing of the airplane, and moments later the upper wing collapsed and folded back, and the airplane did a couple of strange maneuvers which I didn't understand. Crashed, horrendous noise. Well, it sounded like it was almost in the backyard. And then there was an explosion. And there were pieces of that burning airplane fell in our yard. And I started to pick one up, and Dad said, don't touch it, it's hot. I could see the flaming embers on this thing. So it turned out, Dad walked over with me to the crash on the street behind our house. The explosion, at first I thought the explosion was the plane burning, but no, the airplane mess also was covered with gasoline. And some bystander flipped a cigarette into the flaming mess, and that caused the explosion. So, of course, by the time we got over to the crash scene, there was an ambulance there, and they were picking up the remains of the man. I asked Dad, I said, is the pilot okay? He said, no, the pilot's dead. And I said, well, will he come back to life like Jesus did? He said, well, he will, but we'll talk about that tonight. And in the meantime, well, let's get out of the crowd. Many years later, I went to Owensboro because my brother was now a minister. He was preaching in the same church that my dad had pastored. So I was talking to the lady in the newspaper office, and she said, oh, I remember that very well. But just a minute. So for 5 minutes, she's back with a print of the newspaper that day, and she read it and said, you know, your description of that incident is so close to what was in the paper that I would think you wrote the newspaper. And so anyway, oh, okay. Well, that incident, of course, scared the daylights out of my sister and me. We wouldn't even go to the bathroom by ourselves. We were terrified, yet I was in love with airplanes. You know, I was strictly mechanically involved. I played with mechanos and logs, Lincoln batters, or built little airplane models out of metal. And it didn't take long before my fear was totally overcome when Lindbergh landed in Paris. Now, I already knew quite a bit about Lindbergh because even before this accident, I had been reading magazines, particularly the National Geographic and the newspapers, and cutting out everything I could find on airplanes. So I had quite a collection of pictures even when I was 5 and 6 years old. So here I was on my 6th birthday, Lindbergh landed in Paris. So that's a very significant date to me. the other day I made a commitment that I would deliver a speech on the 100th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight. I said, sure, I'll be 106 years old, but I'll do the best I can to give you a speech. So I've got to jump ahead now several years. I have a good
Well,
friend.
where are you going to be giving that speech?
Pardon?
Where are you going to be giving that
Unspecified.
speech? Okay.
Just wherever they want it.
Okay. What's the organization?
Just general people.
Okay.
I think the American Aviation
Yeah.
Historical
Okay.
Society. But the guy that put this video together is a brilliant photographer, especially for Arizona highways, and also a brilliant man on the computer. This is Chuck Olson,
Chuck Lawson.
or Chuck Lawson, rather. Yeah, you know Chuck Lawson.
Oh, yeah.
And he put together an interview with me, and it starts out with this airplane story.
Yes, I've watched Chuck's
You
video
watched
of you many times.
Yeah.
It's an excellent video.
So that's where it started out. Now, this scrapbook that I put together, my lady friend here has called Baby Boy Scrapbook, because in this scrapbook she found my original birth certificate, which identified me as a baby boy. Now, I had trouble when I got into the service. When even as a second lieutenant, something came up that I had to have a passport. So I called my dad. I said, Dad, I'm a shave tail. I can't go before a major or something and say, I'm baby boy Griffith, I need a passport. He quickly got me a passport that had my correct name on it. But anyway, my lady friend decided that she was going to call that Baby Boy Scrapbook. And that was saved. Mother saved that for me all during the war. And I was loading it up with pictures. It took me right up to the start of the war. And I kept adding to it. And as you can see from my room here, I've got thousands of pictures now, many of which I've taken myself, and others were commercial pictures and pictures that I traded with other people. But I still call it Baby Boy Scrapbook, even though it's got a lot of videos in it now. Probably this video will go in there.
Absolutely. Plus on the internet. Tell about your time flying at Wright-Patterson.
Okay. Well, actually, I've got to go back a little bit further. I took ROTC when I was in college. I was really interested in airplanes. We had an old fuselage of an early Jenny with no covering on it in our mechanical engineering laboratory. And I used to sit in that once in a while and just move the stick to watch the controls move. And so I was determined then that someday I wanted to be a pilot. But through ROTC, I wound up in the Corps of Engineers. And I managed to buy 2 rides in an airplane. One was an Stinson trimotor. It was competitive with the old Ford trimotor. And the other was a little Waco plane. It was similar to the planes I would later on fly, but they just sort of enhanced my further desire to fly. But then I got to meet Al Williams. And Al Williams was a very famous aviator in Pittsburgh because they had an organization in the Scripps Howard Live newspapers called the Junior Birdmen, Junior Aviators. And a man by the name of Al Williams, a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, was the head of that organization. Now, the whole story of Al Williams is a totally different story, but one of the historians of naval aviation has identified Al Williams as one of the greatest naval aviators who ever lived. But we'll come back to that. That's a whole different story. But anyway, here I am now in ROTC studying aeronautical engineering. But in the way the Corps of Engineers, the way the ROTC worked, whatever branch you were a student in, and I was a student in the Corps of Engineers, that was to be your course. So when I was called to active duty right after Pearl Harbor, in fact, the very day of Pearl Harbor, I was called to active duty in the Corps of Engineers, and I served for about 1.5 years at Fort Belvoir as an engineering officer, instructing in the bayonet, taking majors and lieutenant colonels who were reserve officers from years back and they'd forgotten how to use a bayonet and how to pitch a tent, so trying to bring them up to date and learning how to build bridges and a little bit on how to drive tanks with a 130 caliber machine gun in them.
So you've driven a tank then?
I drove a little tank with 130 caliber machine gun in it.
And have instructed in
Right.
driving a tank. See, now that's something you never told me about before, Ole.
Yeah. Well, I have a picture of me sitting in the tank with a tanker's helmet on and a 130 caliber machine gun pointing out. I showed that to a friend of mine who was a real tank driver. It's a whole separate story. But anyway, I was determined somehow that I could get into flight training, but I figured that was a lost cause. But anyway, I saw a notice that appeared on the bulletin board, signed by Major General Arnold, who was chief of the Army Air Corps at that time. And it said, any junior officer, captain or below, who wants to apply for flight training as a bombardier, navigator, or pilot may apply directly to my office. Do not go through channels. I said, boy, that's my chance. So I fired off an application to General Arnold's office, and the guy who was processing was the father of a high school friend of mine. And unfortunately, he took advantage of our friendship and he tried to expedite it, and somehow it got lost. So then I had to put it in again. And 2 weeks later, I got a notice that I have been accepted by General Arnold for consideration. I should go to the classification center in Nashville, Tennessee, and see if I qualified. And I qualified. They gave us a series of tests and said, yeah, you're qualified to be a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. Now I get down to Maxwell Field, and I said, what do you want? And I said, I want to be a pilot. So they sent me down to Maxwell Field, and I went through the same basic course that the ordinary cadet would go through. This was taking you around and showing you instruments. You didn't get to fly.
But you were not a cadet, you were already a commissioned officer.
That's right, but I was, even though a student officer, I had to go through with the cadets here.
Right.
I got certain privileges that I ate in the officers club and got saluted and so on. But anyway, even though, so I went through the classification center at Nashville, was classified as being okay for pilot training, was sent to Maxwell Field, and that was the #1 station that the cadets went through. But we went through that too, and that was it was sort of like basic training in the Army now. Treating to drill. However, being officers already, we didn't have to go through the dishwashing and guard duty sort of stuff. So anyway, after that, I was sent to pilot training because I had qualified now as suitable material to be a pilot. So I went to pilot training down in Florida. We had a choice. As student officers, we had our choice. So I saw that Arcadia, Florida had 2 schools. I said, boy, that must be a great town. Well, it turns out there were 2 fields there, but it wasn't much of a town. It was just halfway between Tampa and Miami, which was right out in the Everglades. Anyway, I went through primary flight school there, and there I had my first flight of a military airplane. And we flew with the cadets. Even though we were recognized as officers, we had up through captain, so we had lieutenants and majors. I was a fairly senior lieutenant at that time. So we went through the same thing as cadets, and I went up for my final check ride, and I was scared to death because I was having trouble landing the airplane. And finally, the instructor said, "What the hell are you looking at when you try to land?" I said, "I'm looking at that wheel down there." He said, "You're one of the student officers, and you never had one instructor all the way through." I said, "No, we had a different instructor every time I flew." "Didn't anybody ever tell you not to look at the damn wheel?" "No, sir, they never did." So we shot 2 more landings looking where I'm supposed to look. He said, "Okay, fly it yourself now."
So what aircraft were you flying?
This was a Stearman.
A Stearman. Okay, that's what I thought, but I want to clarify.
Yeah, so that was the toughest part of flying for me. So we went on to basic, and I did well there. Went on to, I chose.
What did you fly in basic?
Basic was the BT-13,
Okay.
the Vultee vibrator,
Yep.
as we called it. Then I went and I figured, well, I really don't think I'm a fighter pilot by nature. I'm not the kind of a guy that enjoys physical contact with somebody. So I think I'll take multi-engine training. So I went to Freeman Field, Indiana, and there I flew the AT-10, which is a little, there were two basic trainers at that time. Well, three. There was the AT-10, which was an all-wood airplane. There was the Cessna Bobcat, which was called the Wichita Bomber or something. And
the AT-9.
there was anything else, you know.
Yeah, and the AT-9 was one of the others.
Oh, right, the AT-9 was the other. There's only one of those left. That's in the Air Force Museum.
Did you fly an AT-9?
I never flew the 9, but that was specifically used as a trainer for people who were going to be B-26 pilots, because it had very similar characteristics to some of the B-26s.
And the third one was the AT-11, wasn't it?
No, that wasn't really a primary trainer. That was that airplane, the derivative of the Twin Beach.
Yeah, but wasn't that in the phase that you were flying in the Cessna Bobcat?
It was used primarily as a navigation trainer or bombardier trainer.
Okay, so that was the AT-11 was in a was in the next phase of training
for navigators.
Okay.
Yeah, we did. I did fly the AT-7 a lot after flying school, but they were not.
The AT-11.
Pardon?
The AT-7, you say, or
The
AT-11?
AT-7, 11, and also the F-2, the photo version. I flew all of those later on, but they were not used for pilot training.
Okay, the F-2 is the photo version of what?
Pardon?
The F-2 was the photo version of what?
Of the Beechcraft. It was the Twin Beach.
Okay.
It was just like the C-45, except it had cameras in it.
Okay. Go ahead.
So then I went through flying school and got my wings. And again, as student officers, we were allowed a little bit of preference in stating what we wanted to do. And I said, well, I wanted to fly with Elliott Roosevelt in his fighter planes. I heard he was going to have P-38s in North Africa. So I said, when the orders came in, I said, boy, you are really lucky. You got it. You're going to Bowling Field to Elliott Roosevelt's P-38 outfit. Well, I got to Bowling Field. Son, there's no 92nd. No, it was the 91st Photo Squadron. So there's no 91st Photo Squadron here. So they looked around and said, oh, that's up in Reading, Pennsylvania. You're supposed to go up there. So I go up to Reading, Pennsylvania, and I said, what kind of airplanes do they got? So I think they're going to have P-38s. So I said, boy, this is great. So I get there to Reading, Pennsylvania, and what are the airplanes that are lined up? O-46s. You remember the O-46? That was a high-winged, single-engine parasol observation plane.
Curtis Owl, wasn't it?
No, that was even before the Owl. The Owl was the O-52. Now, this was a very early plane, even before the O-47. But anyway, I said, gee, are we still flying O-47s? Oh, no, sir, we're going to get B-25s, but they're not here yet. So shortly the B-25s come in, and they said, don't unpack, you're going to Denver, Colorado. So it really didn't take time to unpack. They just loaded us in the airplanes, flew us out to Denver, Colorado, and Lowry Air Force, No.
Lowry's in Denver.
No, that was Lowry. It was the other one I'll think of it in a minute. It was another airfield in Denver. No. The name will come to me later.
Okay.
Before this video is over.
Okay.
It'll come to me. Buckley.
Okay.
Buckley Field was on their side of.
Yeah.
Lowry continued in effect as a major photo training school, but Buckley was believe it or not, on the ramp was a Martin O-10, a B-2, a B-10. There was a B-10 on the ramp. And I said, gee, are we still flying those things? They said, no, that's in here for training. So I wish I'd taken a picture of it then. But anyway, I was assigned to this 91st Photo Squadron. Now, it turned out that was a very famous squadron. It was very famous in World War I also. Remember, there was a 91st, 92nd, 93rd, 94th. I think Lloyd Becker was with the 94th Aero Squadron. Well, the 91st, which had the same insignia that I had in World War II, was in South America. Now, they had a surplus of pilots at that time in our squadron. And here I was, an awkward guy, a very senior first lieutenant, with 0 flying time outside of flying school. And all these other guys, second lieutenants and so on, with a whole bunch of photo time. So they were wondering what the hell to do with me. Well, they lost a crew in South America and said, you'd be the ideal replacement down there. So here I am now, still this very senior first lieutenant with 0 flying time outside of flying school. And I was sent to South America, and it was very interesting missions. It was part of the 311th Photo Wing, which was a worldwide wing under General Arnold's direct control. And we had squadrons all over the world. And the 91st basically was in charge of South America. We were divided into 3 flights, and my flight was in Tulare, Peru. I was actually in Colombia, Cali, Colombia. When I got there, it was moved down to Tulare, Peru. If you look at a map of South America, you see there's a bulge out in the Pacific. It goes west, so that's the westernmost point of South America. So we were stationed there, flew out of there for about 6 months, largely doing work for photographing the disputed border between Peru and Ecuador. This was more of a State Department mission than anything else. And then we were moved down to Santiago, Chile, and that introduced several new things for us. One thing, we had to burn all of our maps from Peru because of the diplomatic arrangements. They couldn't have pictures of Peru given to Chile, so we had to burn all of our maps. We were also told that we would wear civilian clothes all the time down there, except when we were flying. We could wear uniforms when we flew. Also, we must become very friendly with the Chilean Air Force, because a Chilean officer would be flying with us on every mission. Hello.
Hi.
It's can you hold that just a second?
Yeah.
Let me take my pills here. If I miss these pills, well, I'll be off schedule. Oh, that's just water, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. You just put it on the counter there.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so here now we're in Chile, Santiago. Am I shaking or? Now this was very interesting. I had a cavalry officer assigned to me, Roberto Jimenez. And the first time he comes out to the plane, he has his cavalry boots on, his spurs, and his saber. So I told him, sorry, Captain, you can't fly with a saber and cavalry boots with spurs. Oh, so if I were to be killed, my family would be dishonored. I said, well, you can take your boots off if you want to. So he preferred to take his boots off. It was after one flight at high altitude, he started wearing flying boots. So we had some very interesting missions down there. We mapped all of South America, including right over to the border with Argentina. Now, of course, Argentina was a neutral nation at that time. We were prohibited from flying over it, but we flew close enough to the border that we were able to take a few pictures. And when we were there, the decision was made to convert the airplane from the F-2, the B-25 that we flew with photo version was called the F-10, F for photo. The decision was made then to prepare us for longer range flights, and they were going to convert us to the B-17s, which was known as the F-9. So the squadron moved back to Denver, and before they moved, the squadron commander came down with a B-17, and he wanted me to fly with him as co-pilot and visit all the bases that we would be using with the B-17s. So we went into Paraguay, and he managed to sneak a little pass over Argentina just to say we did it, and worked out the arrangements with Paraguay to station our planes there, with the intent, I suppose, of getting pictures across the river. And then we went on and visited all the other bases in Brazil and British Guiana, and on up to Howard Field. And then I was left at Howard Field to take care of the base arrangements for the move of the squadron from Denver down to Howard Field in the Canal Zone. And actually that lasted about 3 months. And during that time I checked out in as much as I could. I got friends with a B-24 squadron commander, and he checked me out of the B-24. I made friends with a B-26 guy, and this was the old Martin B-26, the Widowmaker. I got checked out in the B-26, and
This is back stateside.
no, this is still in Panama.
Oh, you're in Panama,
Panama at that time.
when you got all these checkouts. Okay.
Yeah, and then my tour was up, and I went back to Denver. And first thing that greeted me there was I had orders to re-establish my currency in the B-24 to go to Alaska. And and I'd also applied for the Air Force Institute of Technology, which was just going to open up. So before I went to Alaska, but the orders came through sending me to Wright Field, so that killed the orders to Alaska, which didn't displease me at all. So I was in the first class at Athens, and my classmates included, I was still a very senior first lieutenant, but they were mostly lieutenant colonels and colonels, majors in the class, and a lot of guys became astronauts. Many of my classmates there were astronauts or became astronauts by flying conventional airplanes above into the stratosphere.
So what time frame was this that you went
That
to
was
Athens?
46, 47.
Okay.
Because I graduated from Athens, first class, in 46. And my orders were to Wright Field. And interestingly enough, I went through the Institute of Technology, and I was at the top of my class, even though my class consisted of me as a first lieutenant, 3 or 4 captains, a couple of majors, 2 lieutenant colonels, and a bird colonel. I was a high-ranking first lieutenant, and I was at the top of the class. They wanted to send me to Harvard to get an MBA, and I thought, why can't I go to let me go to a better campus where I don't have to write a thesis. So I picked Stanford, and I went out there, and I got my master's in production engineering. And interestingly enough, I took one 3-unit course called Statistical Quality Control. Now, I studied enough math to know that I didn't want to do anything with statistics, but I really admired the professor. So he reinstated my liking for statistics, and word came back to Wright Field that they had a captain out there who had gotten his master's degree in statistical quality control. So I was assigned to the inspection office at Wright Field, and I said, well, there are a couple of mistakes here, Captain or Colonel. I says, I'm a lieutenant, not a colonel, not a captain, and my master's degree was in engineering, not in statistics. So that's all right, you're the statistical quality control officer for the Air Force right now. And the guy's name was Colonel Bradley. Now, Mark Bradley, remember, that became a 4-star general later on. But he said, now I want you to give a lecture on statistical quality control to all these colonels and brigadier generals who work for me. He said, they're a stuffy bunch of old bastards. He said, so make it interesting. So in my discussion on statistics, I told him how the laws of statistics affected the way dice roll and the way cards are drawn. And my PhD's resistance was the way Anheuser-Busch used statistical quality control to control the quality of their beer. So he says, hey, that was a pretty good talk, especially the story about dice and beer bottles. So a few years later, Mark Bradley is now a 2-star general, or a 4-star general in Europe. And I ran into him in the men's gym. He said, you're the guy that screws around with dice and beer bottles, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, how would you like to work for me? And I said, General, I'd love to work for you again, but so I'm in operations now. So, anyway, later on, he became the president or the senior president of the Garrett Corporation, and got me into the Garrett Corporation later on. When I reported to Garrett in Los Angeles, in Phoenix, somebody came in and said, oh, General Bradley says, well, he wants to see you as soon as you arrive. And so he said, well, General Bradley's at a conference right now. He said, if General Bradley wants to see anybody right now, he says, right now. So I walked into this room full of people that I'm going to be working with, but I've never met before. I said, Ole, did you get over your VD? So, oh, yes, sir. He said, "This is a guy that screws around with dice and beer bottles." What a hell of an introduction. So that worked out pretty well, because years later, we built the secondary power system for the B-1. And I got a call from General Bradley one day. He was the executive VP of Garrett now. And he said, "When are you going to have the first run of that power system?" I said, "General, we're going to run it next Thursday." He said, "I'll be there. I want to bring 2 of my buddies." I said, "Well, if you'll tell me who your buddies are, I'll make sure we have passes for them." It's Kurt LeMay and Jimmy Doolittle. I said, "Well, for General Doolittle and General LeMay, I don't think we'll have any trouble getting them in." So the program manager and the chief engineer and I gave them the briefing. I have a nice picture of 3 4-star generals being briefed by us.
Yes, I've seen that picture and I have a copy of it. Fantastic photo.
3 civilians now briefing all generals. Yeah, it was funny on the way out of the chamber when LeMay, of course, much bigger than Doolittle, put his arm around General Doolittle. He said, "Boy, they sure are putting a lot of heavy crap on my hands where you have these engines." Doolittle said, "Yeah, Kurt, but it beats the hell out of hand cranking."
But it what?
Beats the hell out of hand cranking.
Hand cranking.
Well, I thought that was pretty funny.
Flying it right, Pat.
Pardon?
Flying it right, Pat.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so
Hold on.
by the time I'm working for Garrett, I was retired from the Air Force.
So start again there, because I interrupted with a cough.
By the time I was working for Garrett, that was after I retired from the Air Force. So back at Wright Field now, that was my first assignment after the Institute of Technology. So I was assigned to the group of pilots who included all the test pilots. Because at that time, Muroc was just a base. It was not the test facility. So we did all the flight testing of new airplanes at Wright Field, Wright-Patterson. There were 2 fields, Patterson and Wright Field. They were combined later on into Wright-Patterson. So it's known as Wright-Patterson now. But anyway, I have a set of orders establishing my flying status at Wright Field. And on that set of orders are Captain Charles E. Yeager and Captain Bob Hoover and Ole Griffith. So with names like Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover, I was in a pretty good crowd of people. And most of them were really, really genuine test pilots. So anyway, I flew primarily P-51s and P-47s there. Checked out in a C-46 to do transporting passengers, because at that time we had a little airline at Wright Field, and we flew we flew C-47s to Washington every day, to Mobile, Alabama every day, and to San Antonio every other day. And so they just went through the list of pilots and called up and said, "Do you want to take the Mobile plane tomorrow?" Or, "Yeah, I can go. I'll go." "Okay, you're co-pilot or your pilot. You going to San Antonio?" "Yeah, I'll go to San Antonio." So there was a lot of good C-47 flying time.
So what was your impression of flying, these various aircraft that you mentioned?
Oh, I loved it.
Pluses and minuses and favorite
favorite
characteristics of various airplanes.
As us old timers say, flying is hours and hours of boredom intercepted by moments of stark terror, and I have to buy that. But I just love flying. I wanted to fly everything I could. And the more I settled down to Wright Field, the more my boss told me, "You stay the hell out of these foreign airplanes." Because at that time, all the foreign airplanes from the World War II, the Italian, German, and Japanese planes were still at Wright Field. And nothing I wanted to do more than fly a ME-109 or something like that. And he said, "You stay out of those foreign airplanes and let these paid fighter jocks fly them." It turns out, after I retired and I went into this Beatitudes retirement community, and one of my friends here was the guy who was the chief test pilot for the foreign airplanes. and I heard some very nice stories from him. But
And who was that?
you know, I'll think of his name in a minute. But he was a major, and just has some truly fantastic stories that I'll tell you about. He'd fly in with German airplanes or Japanese airplanes, and sometimes he'd fly over an army base and they'd take shots at him before they realized he was an American pilot. But so anyway, I continued to fly at Wright Field. I flew the 51 and the 47, and I got to fly the P-82. I checked out in the P-82, twin Mustang, and that was about the extent of my flying there. Although I got quite a bit of flying through a friend of mine. I fell in love with a young lady whose father was a major general, and he was the head of research and development at Wright Field. And I got to know a lot of other high-ranking people through dates with Kay, and her girlfriends, of course, were all daughters of 2- and 3-, 4-star generals too. So got to meet a lot of nice, interesting people there.
Well, this ties in just a little bit, doesn't it, with when you almost met Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah, now that's an interesting story. I say that I had 3 meetings with Charles Lindbergh. The first one is covered by this picture up here, which was taken. You have a picture that you shot there?
Are you talking about the
this one right here.
Oh, yeah.
Immediately after he returned from Paris on that lone Eagle flight, he flew around to all 48 states. And when he came into Kansas City, we were staying with my grandparents who lived right near Kansas City, and Dad took us down to the airport. And this was July or August of 1927, so I would have been 6 years old then. And when I took this picture, I was on Dad's shoulders using Mother's old Lux camera, and I shot this picture of Lindbergh, and Mother took the same camera and took a picture of the Spirit of St. Louis taxi again. So they're both in the baby boy Griffith's photo album. Okay, so anyway, I'd say that was my first meeting with Lindbergh, so I saw him face to face. Now the second time I met him was sort of a spiritual meeting. My wife and daughter and I wife and sister and I were on a cruise to Hawaii. We were on Maui, and as soon as I realized we were on Maui, I said, I've got to see Lindbergh's grave. So I started inquiring among the taxi drivers, and I got the same answer from every one of them. The long trip over there, it costs you a lot of money. It's a bad road, very rough road. There are a lot of bandits out there. And I don't know exactly where it is. One guy says, I know exactly where his grave is. I said, how do you know? Because I buried Mr. Lindbergh. So I snapped my fingers, and into the car jumped my wife and my sister, and we drove out the very same dirty road out in the boondocks of the island of Maui. And we reached a little place where there was a little sign, a little arrow pointing off to the left. Probably it was a half-inch wood with about 3 feet long, and it says with a Hawaiian name on it, and the arrow pointing down the hill. So we drove down this little hill for a short distance. We stopped at a place which just happened to be John's home, and I got out my movie camera, my old Sony movie camera, and I took a picture of him and interviewed it on tape, and I still have that tape. He says, my name is John, and my father was a forester, and he cut down the trees that Mr. Lindbergh selected to have used in making his casket. But then he was also a good carpenter, so he made the casket as Mr. Lindbergh directed. And the day that Mr. Lindbergh died, we put him in the coffin, We dressed him in a military uniform with no rank on it. We put him in that pickup over there, drove him over there to the gravesite, and 2 days before, my uncle and I had dug his grave, and we lowered the coffin exactly as he wanted it, so that he was facing toward the United States with his head pointed north, with no rank or insignia. So there was a plaque already made on his grave, and it said, "I shall take up the wings of the eagle and fly to the uttermost ends of the earth." And I said, "Gee, that sounds kind of biblical." Now, this is apart from the regular story, but I checked with my pastor friends, and we found out those words are from a psalm. I forget the number of the psalm, but there's another sentence that follows that. It says, "I shall take up the wings of an eagle and fly to the uttermost ends of the earth, and there I shall find my Lord and follow him." But that's not on the tombstone. I often wondered why it was not on the tombstone, because I don't think he was he certainly was not an openly religious man, but I know from all the things I've heard about him, he must have been a deeply religious man in spirit. So anyway, I figured that was my second meeting with Lindbergh now. Now, my third meeting with Lindbergh actually never happened. General Carroll's daughter had just gotten her degree at St. Louis University in Washington.
This is Kay, who you refer. This is Kay, who you referred to earlier.
This is Kay, yeah. Kay was General Carroll's daughter, Mary Kathleen Carroll. She had just gotten her degree at Washington University at the same time I got my master's degree at Stanford. So we worked out the deal, because I knew she'd be going back to Wright Field for the summer with her parents, and I had orders back to Wright Field. So we agreed that I would pick her up in St. Louis. We'd visit around St. Louis for a couple of days and then drive back to Dayton. So we visited, we went out to a movie show and the zoo and so on in St. Louis, then headed on, and at Indianapolis, we began to have trouble with the car. So I called her home and talked to Mrs. Carroll. And she said, "Oh, I hope," said, "we have guests for dinner, and we want Kurt to meet them." I was going by my middle name, Curtis. Said, "We want Kurt to meet our guests of honor." Said, "How fast can you get here?" They said, "From Indianapolis to Dayton, probably a couple hours." "Well, make it as fast as you can." So anyway, we made it as fast as we could. By the time we got there, the lights were out. There was a note on the front door from Mrs. Carroll. It said, "Kurt, do not drive to Pittsburgh tonight. I've made a bed for you on Thomasina's bed." Thomasina was the family cat. Breakfast is at 7. So at 7, I joined them for breakfast and greeted the General and Mrs. Carroll. And he said, "Well, how'd you and Thomasina get along last night?" "Oh, we got along fine. Thomasina and I are old friends." He said, "Well, you know, our guests last night were Anne and Charles Lindbergh." "Oh, my God." And he said, after dinner, we adjourned to the living room for a drink, and Lindbergh stepped on Thomasina's tail. Thomasina jumped up on my hands, laughed, tore off her skirt. So that was the end of the evening. So I thought, oh, jeez, how close I came to meeting Lindbergh. So, anyway, I met him once by photo, once psychologically, once philosophically.
Yeah. F-101s.
F-101s. Okay. By this time, now I was a lieutenant colonel. I was a commander of a base in France. And at one time, it was known as the 7486th Air Base Group, Air Defense Group. We had an Air Defense Group which had 2 fighter squadrons in it. That was a temporary move, so the fighter squadrons were thence removed, and I just supported the fighter squadrons. But anyway, our basic, I had under me for support were 2 F-84F squadrons, or F-84Fs, and 1 F-100D interceptor fighter, which belonged to a different wing. And this was this base was in France, just west of Strasbourg. And we finally got word that we were going to convert to jets now. All jets. We were going to get the RF-101.
Hello, hello.
And we had considerable work to do to get...
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hello, hello, hello.
You got some more medicine for me?
Yeah.
How about if I see you a little bit later? Could we do that?
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. So we needed a barrier put in.
Okay. Can you back up and start about F-101s again so that we don't have the...
Okay, yeah, well, the F-101 started when we were at Fallsburg, and I had the two RF-84F squadrons on the base. It was the same wing that I belonged to. It was by this time it was the 10th Photo Wing, but we had the 56th Fighter Wing. Also had an F-100, F-86D on the base. So anyway, we got word that we were going to convert to the RF-101C. And so one of the first things we had to do was erect a barrier. Because we had about 5,000 feet runway, just like the Sedona Airport, set up on the runway like an aircraft carrier. Cliffs on both ends. So being on French territory, we had to use French contractors. They were the same contractors that built the runway so badly that the first time any jets landed there, it cracked up. So I spent my first year there supervising the French rebuilding the runway. So now they were going to build put the regular barrier up, regular connecting wire barrier. And this is going to be on a jet. So the F-84s never used a barrier, but we needed one for the RF-101. And I was not happy with the way the construction was going, so we got permission to call the Army Corps of Engineers in. So we got the Army Corps of Engineers in to put the barrier up for us. And we put up a barrier on one end, and actually, before I left, we'd caught 3 airplanes, 3 RF-101s in there. The weather was turning kind of bad when we got the first planes, when we were supposed to get the first planes. And the first planes that came over were a flight of 4, came from Georgia, led by the wing commander back there. And they came in late at night. Our group, our wing commander was up in the tower with me, and these 4 F-101s came in at low altitude, and as they went by the tower, they all lit afterburners, and 3 of them went roaring straight ahead, 1 of them went roaring straight up in the air, through the clouds, and then we see a parachute coming down. So 3 of the planes landed, and the parachute was downtown. And I said, that's right in the middle of Sarburg. So the wing commander said, you go there, I'll stay here. So I went down to the middle of town, and lo and behold, this plane had crashed right in the middle of the town square at dinner time. So there must have been 10,000 Frenchmen around there having beers, but not a soul was hurt. And the priest was down there, the priest went over there real fast. And he told them that pilot had skillfully guided the airplane so that it would crash right in the middle of this square.
So what was the cause of the accident?
The cause of it was an actuator, stabilizer actuator problem. And it actuated to where the elevators were in the full up position. But when he hit the afterburners, well, whatever happened, he also had full up controls.
So he didn't intentionally zoom.
He does not remember pulling the ripcord. So all hell broke loose and he was floating down in his parachute. So he hung on a tree for a couple hours before they finally found him.
So did you check out on the F-101?
No, I went down. Oh, okay. Then now it was wintertime, and the decision was made that we would go down to Noiseur, which was basically a base for SAC bombers. But we were also using, our fighters were using it for training. So we took the whole squadron down there, and they were to check out down there. So I didn't check out. I got to taxi the plane a little bit, but I was to the point of I had never been able to get a ride in it. So I finally flew the 101 when I came back for another reason. But the 101 was supported by the Ogden Depot. So while I was still at Fallsburg, lo and behold, the commander of the depot was General Roby, for whom I'd worked before in the Air Force. And he had been the commander of the depot at Châteauroux, France, and then he went to Ogden. So he was now coming in to visit the bases that had the airplanes that he was supporting. So he wanted to see Fallsburg, so we showed him around and had a good visit with him. And we had some nice private conversations about some of our events back at Wright Field. And then he went on to become a two-star in Washington. And I think he was in charge of all high-tech airplane developments.
So did you ever fly in a Century Series aircraft?
I did. I had a flight on the 100 back at Wright Field, and then I had a couple of flights in the RF-101, which I didn't check out.
How about, you said you had the RF-84s and F-86Ds. Did
Right.
you check out in those?
I did not check out in those.
Did you ever get, well, let's see, I guess they didn't have two-seaters on either of those, so you couldn't have gotten a ride. So.
No, I was pretty close to the F-106 guys because when I was an Air Force Flight Representative at Hughes, I became familiar with the fire control systems on the three fighters at that time. One of them was the F-86D. So I knew the fire procedures, the firing systems on the F-106-86D.
The fire control system.
Fire control
Yeah.
system, yeah.
And you mentioned F-106s?
Yeah, I never flew the 106, but I was familiar with it when I was at Hughes.
Okay, well, tell us about Hughes then.
Well, that was an interesting assignment. I was at San Bernardino, and I had the job of assistant to the commander for quality control. So I was involved in the procurement, the supply, and the maintenance end of things. And I also knew the director of procurement and production. I'd known him for many years. And he knew that I would love to be a plant representative. So he called me up one day and said, "Hey," said, "we need a new plant representative at Hughes Aircraft." And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm interested." So I went over there, and this was the critical period in the Hughes company, because Hughes had now soured himself with the Air Force. For one thing, we wanted to, Hughes was, the fire control systems on the F-86, 94, and the F-94, F-89 were all built by Hughes. And they were the E4, 5, and 6 fire controls. And we wanted to go to a second source for the fire control systems that were going to be used on the F-106. And he says, "No way, you're not going to go to second source. You're not going to get the drawings." So Hughes, as I understand it, my Secretary Simon could pretty much hold two of Hughes, and we did not want to do business with Howard Hughes anymore. He better get himself out of the business. So Howard Hughes then set up the Hughes Aircraft Company as a subsidiary of the Howard Hughes Medical Research Foundation. So presumably then Howard Hughes, was not involved with the company. But the aircraft division of the Hughes Tool Company was still there. So now I had two Hugheses on the plant, one of which Howard Hughes had nothing to do with, and one of which Howard Hughes had everything to do with. Common runways, common hangars, common buildings, common people working the airplanes. They fired the Air Force plant representative and assigned me as the replacement for him. Now I thought, boy, this is probably one of the best jobs in the Air Force, as I was a fairly fresh lieutenant colonel, and the guy that I succeeded was an old-time lieutenant colonel, and he just sort of dropped out of the picture. I'd been there about 6 months, thoroughly enjoying myself, when I got a call from personnel at right field. It's Major Sarangeli. And I said, yeah, I remember you. He said, yeah, I remember you. 5 years ago, you signed up that you were willing to go to combat. I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I got a job for you. So we need a lieutenant colonel for a staff operations officer at 12th Air Force headquarters in Germany with concurrent travel. You've got 1 month to get to the port of embarkation. I said, could you give me 5 minutes to talk to my wife? He said, hell no, there's 13 guys lined up to take that if you don't. I said, I'll take it. So that was a bad move for me as far as my marriage was concerned.
And what year was that?
That would have been 55. Our embarkation was on a boat. It was December of 55, with 2 kids in diapers from New York. We went over on a World War II troop ship. Took us something like 2 weeks to get across the ocean.
Not the 2 hours of the Concorde.
That's right. My boss made that trip once. Now, the overseas assignment took it to Ramstein, Germany, which was the headquarters of the 12th Air Force. So I said, oh, you're staff operations officer, yeah. Okay, our DCS officer is Colonel Al Evans. They checked in with him. So I got and saluted Colonel Evans, and he said, what do you fly, dogs or hogs? I said, say again? Sir, do you fly dogs or hogs? I said, I'm sorry, sir. I'm not current in fighters. What are dogs and hogs? Well, the dogs are the F-86D and the hogs are the F-84s. I said, well, I've got some T-bird time, but, well, I said, I said, we're all dogs or hogs here. I'm not sure what to do with you. I said, I see your background is procurement. Why don't you go down to the procurement guy? I said, sir, I've worked for him before. I don't think we'd be a good match. He said, well, I've got an operations analysis office here. It's run by 2 civilians, GS-16s, and 3 lieutenant colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels. So I said, well, I know something about statistics. Well, that sounds good. So I'm assigned down there. And these 2 civilians, both GS-16s, which is about the equivalent of a brigadier general, I guess, in the rank comparison. And one of them, well, they had both worked for LeMay on the 8th Air Force doing operations analysis. And he got along well with one of the lieutenant colonels, but not me. The assistant director got along with me, but not the 2 lieutenant colonels. So anyway, it was a sort of an iffy thing. The other 2 colonels I knew from elsewhere, and I got along with all of them fine. But anyway, we had a lot of interesting problems came up in the operations analysis field. A little statistical analysis, on bombing circles and radius of action of nuclear weapons and so on, because we were just getting to the point of carrying nuclear weapons on tactical planes now. And one thing that came up, we were having one field where we were having a lot of trouble with the F-84s running off the runway when they were wet. And he says, your job, Ole, is to figure out why and what we can do about it. So I got looking into the thing and I found out the only field that was having trouble with wet, slippery runways and planes running off the runway was at Spangdahlem. So I got to Spangdahlem and I talked to the pilots, and they were all explaining how, the minute it was wet all the time. That the minute they hit standing water, why their brakes just didn't work, and they'd slide off the runway and very often just pile up the airplane. So I started checking around. I went to a Canadian base. They were having the same problem, but they had solved it by taking graphite chips and salting them down with tar, and then putting them on the runway. So it gave them about a 500-foot surface that was very rough. with these chips, and they weren't having any problems at all. So we decided to try that here. And it goes up to 12th Air Force headquarters, and they didn't like the idea at all. So I got hold of Chuck Yeager, and because Chuck had a fighter squadron there, and I said, could you run some stopping distance tests for us on an F-86, try to get your stopping distance on the concrete runway, so we can compare that with the other bases. So he said, sure. Well, so I told my boss about that. Oh, no, we can't risk an airplane on that. And I said, well, Chuck Yeager says he can do it. Oh, I says, he's just a test pilot, he doesn't know. Because I tell you what you do. He said, you get a brick, and you tie a rubber band on it, you put a band on it, you take an old inner tube, cut it up and make a bunch of tubes, rubber bands out of it, and we can put a hook on it, and a tense measurement. You can pull that brick on the runway, and you can try it on all these different surfaces and measure the coefficient of friction. I said, Fred, you're not serious. He said, yes, sir, that's what I want you to do. So I wind up building this contraption. It's raining like hell. I'm down on my hands and knees in uniform, rain pouring down, and I'm pulling this brick on various surfaces. Pretty soon I looked up as the general here. What the hell are you doing, General? Colonel? And I said, he said, tell me inside. I said, what the hell were you doing down there? So I told him, he said, that's one of Fred Fenim's goddamn ideas. I said, yes, sir, it is. I said, bullshit. He said, as far as I'm concerned, if Chuck Yeager said he'd do it, well, I want Chuck to do it. Meantime, do you like that job you're in? I said, no, sir. He said, what would you like? General, if I'm commander of something on operations, how would you like to be commander at Fallsburg? I didn't know what the hell Fallsburg was, but I said, that sounds fine, General. So he said, okay, go get us my DCS personnel, tell them I want you to cut orders to go to Fallsburg as commander. So I said, well, I said to somebody else, says, what the hell is Fallsburg? They said, that's a base with the next German fighter base. It was all built to receive American fighters. The first fighters came over to try out the runway, and the runway collapsed. So there's no runway there. There's 500 feet of taxiway, and the French are now going to rebuild the runway. So he said it'll probably be a year before they get it rebuilt. So meantime, he said the base is yours. So I talked to the guy now who would be my wing commander, and he said, well, you know, he says, as commander of the base, I'm your wing commander. So anything that's good that happens over there is, I get credit for it. Yes, sir. Anything bad happens, you're responsible, even if you're in Africa. Yes, sir, I understand. So he sort of winks his eyes and said, good luck to you. Said, learn French. So I go there and I've got a French liaison officer there who was French Air Force, but he trained with the Americans. He hated the Germans' guts. So he was very, very helpful to me. Then I had a young Italian guy who was my liaison with the French civilians. So one of my main concerns was community relations, because I knew that if you had good community relations, you were in good shape. If you had bad community relations, it was bad. Most of the bases had the Yankee go home stuff. But anyway, the second day I was there, my secretary came in, Denise, no, what was her name? Anyway, her Chevalier, Annette Chevalier, French as could be, but also spoke about 4 different languages. So she came in one day and said, there's the French man here who owns a bakery. He's extremely angry. He won't talk to anybody but the commander. So I said, okay, bring him in. So this guy comes in with his hat, holding his hat in his hand. He's crying. And Yvette starts laughing. I said, what the hell, did somebody rape his daughter? I said, no. He said that every day he baked 120 loaves of bread, which was just right for his regular clientele. Now all the Americans come in and buy his regular bread, and he has none left for his regular customers. Well, our people go to Germany to buy their bread. I said, why doesn't he just buy another oven and bake some more breads? He said, no, he said that won't work. He has to do what his father did. So I said, well, tell him we'll put his base of bakery off limits. So I put it off limits, and everything was fine.
Well, you'd think he'd be happy that he was selling out his days
You'd think so, but
of production.
and people would drive 150 miles to the nearest Air Force base in Germany, 2 border crossings to get donuts. Do you think any Frenchman would have had the balls to get a bicycle and a donut machine and make donuts in France? No.
So they didn't make donuts?
No.
Why not?
Why should they do it? They didn't invent donuts. They wouldn't make pizza.
Interesting.
We told them, said, if they'd open up a pizza parlor, well, no, that's Italian.
Interesting.
So then when the time to come home, the policy had changed, because when we went over, the policy was that you went by ship. Now it turned out the policy was you flew, with exceptions. So I found out the exception was if you had an illness in the family and you should fly. So I went to our flight surgeon and he said, yes, your son definitely shouldn't fly. So then I put in the personnel. He said, of course, if you go back by surface, you won't necessarily go on the SS United States. He said, you know, we've got the United States and the Constitution, so they're real good ships. He says, you still might go on a cruise ship. So I said, well, I'll take the chances. About that time, a new officer comes in. He brought me in to meet him. And I said, what was your last assignment, Major? He said, well, I was the embarkation officer at the port of embarkation in Brooklyn. The captain tells me you'd like to get back on the United States. I said, sure would. He said, may I borrow your phone? So our 14-day trip over was manifested by a 4-day trip on the SS United States.
You know, that ship still exists. The United States still exists.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not in the greatest shape, as I understand, but it still exists.
Yeah.
Was never scrapped.
Just rusting away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was a nice ship.
Yeah.
I remember one of the waiters we had. Every time he asked him what the food was like, he said, it's sort of like spaghetti. No matter what it was.
Orville Wright's last flight. Orville Wright's last flight.
Okay, I have a video of that. It's an 8-minute video. I'll show it to you today if we have time. But he'd just gotten the first C-69, and as usual, when Orville Wright, or when a new plane arrived, Orville Wright was invited out to fly it. So now I got this from him, not from anybody else. But Orville Wright arrived by limousine. They showed him around the C-69, boarded him on the airplane, put him in the passenger seat, while the general sat in the right seat, and the captain, who was highly qualified as an instructor pilot, took the airplane off. Which they'd first shown Mr. Wright around the airplane. Now they showed him around the cockpit, then they got him in the air. As soon as they got in the air, why, he kicked the guy out of the right seat and invited Mr. Wright to sit in the right seat. So he's in the right seat. Said, Mr. Wright, would you like to fly a little bit? Well, could I? So pretty soon we did a gentle dive, and the general was telling me this, and I reached out and I pulled back on the wheel. And said, Frank Carroll, who the hell do you think you are trying to teach Orville Wright to fly an airplane? But he was amazed at all of it.
So it was General Carroll in the left seat?
Carroll's in the left seat now.
Yeah.
Now the story that was published by the captain was that he was the pilot. And the general told me, he says, BS. He said he was the instructor pilot. He said, that I was the pilot when Orville was flying.
Interesting.
Yeah, General Carroll had some great stories. He was Hap Arnold's chief engineer. Hap referred to him as my chief engineer. But years later, I visited General Carroll in Boulder, Colorado. After he was retired, I was out there in business with the Bureau of Standards. So they entertained me for dinner, and they said, let me show you my shop. So we went to his shop out back, And of course he's got every tool in the world there. He's got a relief tube hanging up beside his desk. Oh yeah, I said, I learned long ago you ought to have a relief tube there when you're working. And I said, there must be a story behind that. And he said, well, yeah, he said, Hap called me in one day and said there's a certain bomb group that's having a lot of problems, that their extreme tail-heavy B-17s are reported, and many times they're just dragging the tail, and oftentimes their bomb releases don't work. So he says, find out what's wrong. He says, yes, sir. So as usual, he goes over to Europe, and the hell with the officers, he goes to the enlisted men. He talks to the tail gunners first. How much ammo do you carry aboard? Sir, we're authorized two cases of ammunition. He says, do you carry anything extra? Yes, sir, if it's a long mission, we may carry 4 cases. He says, do you know what a case weighs? He said, 2 cases of ammunition would really throw the plane out of balance, wouldn't it? He said, well, yes, sir, we have a little trouble with tail wheels once in a while. So he says, okay. He said, 4 cases, or 4K, whatever it was, is what's authorized. He said, okay, we'll look into that. So that's when he gets into the higher headquarters. And he said, by the way, he said, let's talk to the guys to the bombardiers. Why are bomb releases weren't working? Don't know, General. Because you know, we take off, we check those bomb releases every time before we go up. We check them just before we load the bombs on, and half of the bombs just don't release. He looks around and says, where are your relief tubes? We don't have relief tubes here. Where do you pee? On the bombs. At 37,000 feet, what happens to your pee? He said, you'll have relief tubes from now on.
So why did they pee on the bombs? Was it
because they just have relief tubes?
But was it an expression of disrespect for the
for
the enemy, or was it that was just the only way they
pee on the catwalk?
Okay.
So that's why he had a relief tube in his shop. Another one on his steps up to his bathroom. At home he had a picture of a bomb with a class nose in it and a cat going like this. And it was labeled the cat bomb. So I said, General, there must be a story behind that. He said, yeah. I said, Hap called me one day. He said, there's a nut in here who wrote to General Arnold, and they were talking about the lousy bombing accuracy of the bombers whenever they tried to bomb a ship, and the bombs just wouldn't hit the targets. And he said his suggestion is that cats are so afraid of water, and if you put the bomb, if you put a plastic nose on the bomb and put a cat in there, and if the cat saw they were going to miss the target, he would raise hell trying to get the airplane straightened out. He might direct it. And he said, I said, yeah, you don't believe that, do you? He said, no, but he said, this guy's got a lot of political influence. He says, give it a try. So he made a little experimentation. You know, he didn't drop any bombs, but he makes with a well-written theoretical analysis of the tests they'd run, and said, sir, I recommend against this. It's dead.
I've actually seen references to that.
To the cat bomb?
Yes. One of the more bizarre ideas that ever surfaced.
Well, you know, they did have bat bombs, which they used in the Pacific. Did you know that?
I think I've heard something about it, but tell me what you
just tie a little bomb onto the bat with a timed fuse, and at the proper time of day they'd release the bats, and they'd fly into these wooden structures and land, and poop. So I guess they did start a few fires.
Pretty interesting. You know, it's no stranger, I guess, than things like what the Japanese did with the balloons they sent over. You know, the high altitude balloons that they sent over with incendiary devices to set fires, you know, in North America, which
Well, they did have one victory there, didn't they?
Yeah.
Up in Oregon.
Yeah.
Well, did I ever tell you this story that General Foss told us? Wow. You know, after he got his Medal of Honor flying Wildcats, he was then assigned to Corsairs. And most of the new guys who were coming in were just freshly out of Pensacola. And he was having a hell of a time. So he called his bosses and said he needed some help. And so the very next morning there was a knock on his door. And he says, come. He walks this long guy and says, you Captain Voss? He says, yes. He says, I'm Charles Lindbergh. What can I do for you? And so the next thing was, well, where's Charles going to stay? He said, well, Ronald Coleman, you know, lives in Beverly Hills, or not Beverly Hills, but Santa Barbara. And a submarine had come in and launched a shell into Santa Barbara that night. So Ronald Coleman decided he was going to move. He said he gave me the keys to his house, and he said, I'm going to get inland. I don't want to get blown up. He said, use the house here for whatever purpose you can. So he said he left me the keys to his car and left his servants there. He said, so I set Charles Lindbergh up in Ronald Coleman's house while they stayed here. He said after they were through there, Lindbergh said to him, so, but you know, I'm going to the Pacific on a secret mission, and I'd sure like to fly Tail End Charlie with you sometime. And he said, Joe Foss said, Mr. Lindbergh, or Charlie, Charlie, he said, Charlie, nobody who flies for me flies Tail End Charlie. You're going to be a bomber pilot. So he said Lindbergh flew as a bomber mission on every ground support mission they ever flew. So then he went over to the P-38s, and
That was when he was flying Corsairs.
he was flying Corsairs.
Right, and then
He was very successful at Corsairs. And in fact, look up there at the picture of the guy with the goggles. That's Joe Forster. He was a 14-man ace. And he had the record for the longest overwater flight on a single-engine P-38. Something like 1,400 miles. Apparently he was on the Yamamoto raid, and I don't know whether he engaged Yamamoto or not, but anyway, he was engaged. They shot out one engine. And he had this long distance back, no place else but Japanese water. So he said, the first thing I did was fire off all my ammo. But then I thought, now I'm in a hell of a shape if I meet the enemy with no ammo. But he made it through and flamed out as he touched down at his home base. Not a drop of gas left.
firing the ammo may have made the difference.
He was flying the Lindbergh operation for throttle control.
Mm-hmm.
So, he was telling me that the first time he met Lindbergh, he came back from a mission, and he said, "Who's that long-legged guy there that's serving us with no ranks? Is that a sergeant or something? It's got buttons?" "No, that's Charles Lindbergh." He said, "Yep."
This is Joe Forster you're talking about.
Joe Forster, yeah. So he says, he can. And now this picture was given to me by Joe. This picture of the P-38, and it's signed by 3 or 4 of the French aces, of the American aces, including the wing commander. Down on the left corner, the wing commander. I don't think of his name right now, but he was about the 3rd highest P-38 victor after Dick Long and McGee.
McGuire. Tommy McGuire.
McGuire, yeah. So it was a picture that some newsman had taken of Lindbergh talking to McGuire that spilled the beans that Lindbergh was in the Pacific.
Yes, very famous photo.
Yeah, in my collection.
If you have something else, I was going to say, if you want to look at the Orville Wright tape, but if you got some more stories you want to tell, let's keep going.
Well, why don't we go ahead with Orville Wright for a while?
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and stop this now, and